she said, that was a really difficult journey. And he said, you knew who I was the first time that we met. And she said, then why did I have to suffer so much? And he said, if you want to know the nature of life and love, you have to make the journey. And that always comes back to me. For me, this story is not what I'm telling or what somebody's hearing. It is this mediated, dynamic space of intangible and vivid image and experience and space that happens between us, which I think of that more as the story. I do feel often and more it is a living being. I mean, because it is my connection to spirit. I would love to be opened more so that I would have that experience with full confidence. Maybe before I die I will, or at the moment of death. Oh.
I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today I'm pleased to be joined by the American storyteller Laura Sims, who's been telling stories around the world for over 50 years. Inspired as a young woman by the healing work of shamans and native peoples, she sees stories as a healing power in this world and has brought that power to people all over the globe. Laura, thank you so much for joining me today. I was wondering, just to start off, do you have a story for us to chew on?
I do, and it's always the wonderful, it's the challenge and the wonder of it all, because sometimes I just go into a spin like, oh my goodness, what story shall I tell, as if I don't know any. And then, but this morning it was so evident to me. This story needs a small context. It was told to me by a woman. I didn't really like the story, but I was mystified by an image. And about a year later, I was in northern Romania. It's a project in which I was training adolescent orphans to be storytellers who were living in these kind of infamous institutions. And we went to an ethnographic museum in the north of Romania. And the curator took us down into a huge basement chamber that had files. It looked actually like a morgue, where you pull out a door and a body, except on each slab were thousands of 100, 200-year-old embroideries made by peasant women. And they were extraordinary. And he explained to me that these embroideries, which I wanted every single one of them because I wanted to go into them. I wanted to draw them. There were so many that were either women bodies or abstract women or women as trees or trees with birds and sun and moon, hen and rooster. And he said this was the secret language of women. They kept alive something older in the culture. And because these were cloths, the church never noticed. And that story that had been told to me suddenly came alive. And seated amidst all of those embroideries, I told this story with my translator, of course, simulcasting in the sound of Romanian language the fairy tale that I'm going to tell you, which is Eastern European. And it was recorded by Andrew Lang, whose collections are remarkable, actually, for me. There was a king and a queen who had one daughter, and it was time for her to marry. The king wanted an heir to the throne in her husband. The queen loved to make weddings, but she refused. She said, no, I want to embroider. Queen said, peasant women embroider. We could have hundreds of peasant women come and embroider for you. No, I want to embroider. The king and the queen thought that surely she would grow bored of embroidering, just as my parents thought I would get over the fad of telling stories in my 20s, go back to graduate school and do something useful. So every single morning, the princess walked up a winding stairway to a room in a tower that had windows in all directions. She had a table, she had linen cloth, she had yarns of every color, and she began to embroider everything that she saw out the windows and the memory of all the embroideries that she had admired in the homes of peasants, in the chambers inside the palace, and she didn't grow bored. Every night at dinner, the king would say, well, it's time for you to choose a husband. Suitors are waiting. She would say, well, not yet. One afternoon, while she was embroidering, she heard the sound of birds' wings, and she looked, and a pigeon alighted on the windowsill. And so she held out her hand, and the pigeon sat in the palm of her hand. And then the pigeon sat on the table beside her embroidery. And she said, it's so nice to have a companion. To her surprise, the pigeon spoke in a human voice. I'm not really a pigeon. I'm a man. I've been enchanted, and I could visit you every day as a man. If you would bring a bowl of milk and place it here on the table, and I could go in the milk, cover my wings, I would turn into a man, spend the day with you, then leave in the evening. Well, she agreed. And then he warned her, don't tell anyone. If you tell anyone, I wouldn't return again. I'll never tell anyone, she said. But by the time the pigeon had flown away, she had gone down the stairwell. She actually asked herself if this had really happened. But the next morning, she carried a bowl of cow's milk up to the tower, placed it on the table. She began to embroider, but she was very excited. And in the afternoon, the pigeon arrived. He went directly into the bowl of milk, shook his wings, and turned into a man. Sat beside her, watched her embroider. They talked all day. He handed her the colors of threads. In the evening, he would go back into the milk, turn into a pigeon, fly away. This went on until she was falling in love. And her face was so radiant that the queen, her mother, said one evening, you look so beautiful that men must be feeling it because suitors are lining up outside the palace. You should choose a husband, said the king. She said, not yet. And the mother said, If I didn't know that you were alone in that tower, I would think you have fallen in love." And she just said, I love embroidering. But the mother was so curious, and you know how mothers can be, that her mother kept saying, "What is really going on?" And finally, the mother said, "If you don't tell me what is going on, I'm going to lock the doors to the tower and you won't be able to go." She said, "Mother, I can't tell you," which only made her mother more curious. So her mother said, "You can tell me, because then I wouldn't have to ask you again, and I will never tell anyone." And without a thought, she told her mother about the pigeon who turned into a man who she had fallen in love with. And the next morning, she went up to the tower, but the pigeon didn't return. Every day she waited, and she grew so sorrowful that all the radiance disappeared. Suitors left. The king said, "You should choose a husband quickly before no one wants you anymore." And she said, "No, father, just let me go out into the world. Give me 3 pairs of iron shoes. I will cross the world if in 1 year I don't find the pigeon, or I don't hear about a pigeon that turns into a man. I'll come back. I'll marry anyone you choose." She was given 3 pairs of iron shoes, and she wore them all out, as one does in these fairy tales. And she returned without having heard a word about a bird that turned into a man. And after a day in which she agreed that the king could finally choose a suitor for her, she woke up with an idea. And this I understand. She said, "Father, just give me 3 more days. Let me sit on the stone steps of the bathhouse in the village next to the kingdom. And if anyone can tell me an extraordinary story, so unusual a story, and I hear something about the pigeon, then I at least know that it was real. But if I hear nothing, Father, I promise I'll come back and get married." So she said. There was a reward, so people lined up. They made up stories. But she knew that not a single one was true. And just when she was so tired of hearing false stories, a girl came with her mother, a peasant girl. And she said, "I asked my mother, and she said I could tell you this absolutely extraordinary thing that happened. Yesterday morning, I went out to milk the cows and get some water from the well. And I stopped, put down the bucket by the well, when suddenly a rooster wearing wooden shoes came from behind the well. It was so extraordinary that I followed behind him. And the rooster also had a bucket. It was outside the field where the cows were. The rooster milked the cows, and then he carried the bucket in his beak, and he went to a hen house. There were no hens, but on a table there was a very large bowl, and the rooster hopped onto the table, poured the bucket of milk out into the bowl, and immediately 12 pigeons flew to the window ledge, and one after another. They went into the milk, they shook their wings, and 11 of them turned into noble, handsome, well-dressed men. But the 12th, the most sleek of all the pigeons, stayed alone on the ledge as a bird, and the 11 young men bullied him and mocked him, saying, "You were such a fool to believe that human beings can fall in love with a bird that turns into a man. And now you no longer can turn into a man during the day and turn back into a bird. You will be a bird forever." When the princess heard this story, she said to the girl, "Well, would you take me to the well in the hen house?" And sure enough, there was the rooster with wooden shoes. There was the bucket milking the cows, pouring the milk into the large bowl. The girl and the princess waited outside the door unseen. The 12 pigeons came to the ledge. 11 turned into young men and began to just bully and talk and make fun of the 12th pigeon. When the princess walked into the hen house, and she said, "Oh, beloved, it is true that I betrayed you. I told my mother because I thought she would never let me into the tower again. But know this, I love you with all my heart." And the 12th pigeon, our prince, flew into the milk, shook his wings, and turned back into man. Now, the other birds, what happened to them, I don't really know. That night, they turned back into birds. But they followed and flew and circled the palace where the princess that night married the pigeon man. And they each wore the most remarkable embroideries. For those embroideries, the language of the spirit would make their lives filled with joy and fertility and goodness. They ruled together for a very long time, and they ruled with such kindness, the kindness born of an open heart dreaming in the middle of this world, that for as long as this story was told, everyone lived happily ever after. And I am certain that by listening to this story, we have been invited to the wedding.
Thank you, Laura. That was marvelous. I love the spiraling stair and the tower and the embroidery. And also the mother, the harshness of the mother. When I was younger, Jack and the Beanstalk helped me a lot. The way the mother throws the beans out the window. And that helped me at the time because her harshness on some level, perhaps, the beans got to grow, right? And they don't grow in the house, they grow outside. And so the mother in this story, it's interesting too, she's sort of harsh, but things happen maybe because of her. Wow.
Well, you know, there are two things about that I always consider. And one is that harshness, you know, like in The Frog Prince, when Princess just throws the frog against the wall, splatter, and he turns into a man. That, like what you're saying in your life, that sometimes it takes an extreme act to motivate us so that actual change occurs. But the other part of it for me that is so gorgeous in these stories is that really it's not about the characters in the story at all. They're not literal, but that part of us that needs to live through the, not only his actualization, but hers as well, of taking this unconscious longing for embroidery and searching the world and listening to stories and being brokenhearted and feeling the causes and consequences of how we are in the world is so important for us.
Mhm.
I know you know that with your heart and soul, but for anyone who's listening, sometimes it's good to remember because the allure of this story is always the what's happening as if it's really happening, when the only place it's happening is inside of each person who hears it.
And is that an occasion for sorrow or for joy? I mean, there are those who want to find stories in the world in a concrete way. Those who want to find Odysseus's house, for example, and this is the doorway, this is the wall, and prove that it really happened there. But if it just happens inside of us, I guess you're saying it's an occasion for rejoicing, right? That it happens
Well,
within.
I think rejoicing holds in it the deep capacity to experience the sadness at the same time.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it's just happy, happy.
right.
But to rejoice
Hmm.
is to know the truth that both things coexist in the world and that it is that loss and gain. We have so many stories, but I wish it would be this way, or let's, and that just gets us into tremendous trouble,
Yeah.
what we expect or what we want, as opposed to how things are.
Mm. Yeah, these stories don't always give us what we want, right? Is that your feeling?
I mean, I think life, the reality, doesn't give us what we want, but we create a reality that causes us to suffer because we don't get what we think we want. The story, I don't know what the story itself does, because for me, it's always in sort of some kind of collusion with each listener at different times, and what's needed in the world, what the story, like a dream weaver, is giving us, how I tend to read that story, what it reminds me of in my own life. I mean, there's a really terrible series of memories in my life where I have made mistakes by speaking something that I shouldn't speak and then losing everything as a result.
Hmm.
And I used to feel, when you asked that question about joy and sorrow, that I was doomed or fated because I had made this terrible mistake. Until as I've grown older and maybe been, I don't know, tendered by these stories, I see, oh, if that didn't happen, would I be able to tell this story in a way that would sink into people in whatever they need? Because I can't say that anybody hears the story the same way I do. Or would I be able to rejoice in my life? Sometimes I'm on the street and I meet friends and they'll say, Laura, you look so happy. Are you in love? And I go, I am. And they say, oh, with who? And I said, no, 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 no. I'm just in love. So maybe at its most insidious and subtle, the stories, uncover a fundamental love affair with everything,
Mm.
regardless of circumstance.
Mm. So to carry these stories, we go through this ancient ceremony, right, which is always new, of the story. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you as a storyteller carry the shadow of the story, the hard things in it, and does that wear on you, or how do you process that in your practice as a storyteller?
Oh, what a key, essential, and good question, Jay. First of all, I often will spend a lot of time looking at what is not only in the story the most obvious, dreadful shadow part, but other parts that I want to ignore because of what they remind me of. And it is usually those parts of the story that propel us, propel the characters on behalf of us, with us, to change something, to seek something, to experience something, to be broken open, not in disrepair, but in order to actually access the constant resource of repair that is within us all, like nature, the nature. And so I have a great regard for that. More and more at deeper levels, personally. I mean, I just finished writing a book that took me 8 years, and it was going to be like a little month detour to look at a story. But it's the first time I've ever looked so deeply, as if I cleared out a lot of other stories and worked on this one. And it kept allowing me to recognize the role of the storyteller and then the human being, in a way, as both intimately involved in feeling the story and at the same time being able to be a witness, which means that rather than being stuck on the glue of the shadow, which is the very dangerous place for all of us, there's this tremendous space in which you can deeply feel, but you don't have to get captured in it. I mean, I'm not a super person, so I do get captured, but then I can actually come out, which is something as a storyteller is a practice of discernment between myself in the present, who is there not only for the story, but I'm just my ordinary self in some kind of very heightened state, telling this story to others. And in that, I do deeply feel it. It's not like I'm removing my feeling. I'm not a neutral being, but I am a witness. I know the story. I know some of my reactions and biases and trigger points. And I've looked at how everything interacts within the story. This happened, and because this happened, that happened, because that happened, that happened. And do as much research and associative work and deep work on the story and in my own life as I can, so that I know my, Brer Rabbit tar points. I get stuck. And but I've been doing this. I haven't really done anything else in my life. I accidentally became a storyteller at 20, and now I'm 74. So I spend a little bit of time, which in some ways, because I keep discovering things that I think, oh, this is a drop in the bucket. Drop in the bucket time. Anyway, did I answer your question?
I think so. I think so. And so it's almost like the storyteller needs to go there first, needs to feel the darkness of the story and the dark, troublesome parts of it in order to share it with others and to not be consumed, so that they can share it with others and be something of a witness.
Because you've made the journey.
Yeah.
But the journey is not like into the story as much as into my own associations. And that honesty can be so sometimes extremely shocking when I begin to see the consequences of some of the things I've done, or the ignorance, that an addiction to certain things that have had me repeat them over and over again. But it's only when you become a witness and a participant at the same time that you can liberate the energy. So in a way, I fall in love with the worst characters and the worst moments in the story. It's like, oh, okay, here we go.
Yes. Yeah.
What brings me to that story? Why did this story come to me? Why was I summoned? Because I have that relationship with the story. I began in a way before storytelling became a thing. And my parents just thought I had completely lost my mind, which at periods I have, which one has to in order to discover what it is to regain it. But yeah.
And you said you accidentally became a storyteller. Perhaps you could tell us how that accident happened?
Well, I think, first of all, as a child, in order to, well, it was a propensity in my life. A Turkish ashok, an epic singer, once said, "Beyond the Borders in Wales," it's a great festival, asked me what are my earliest dreams that I remember. And I told him one dream. He said, "Oh, of course you're a storyteller." I had to think about that for a few years. But when I was a child, I loved to play in my backyard and with everything that was there and create worlds and characters and events. Sometimes from the many fairy tales that I did read at night, I had a difficult childhood, and so I think it was a way of finding a safe place or a haven or some place where I could put feelings that I had no understanding for. But I would act these stories out. And then when I was a little bit older, I'd get all the girls in the neighborhood, my friends, to act them out with me. And I had ceaseless episodes to these stories. Never would get really bored. It was like, all right, let's do something else. And I would stamp my little Aries foot and say, let's go on with this story. But I dropped out of graduate school after 3 days, and I was going to be a medieval scholar and study at the University of Toronto. I had a fellowship and all of that. I was on the way to almost proving to my parents that I could be, since I hadn't married at 21, that I was a good daughter if I became a teacher, or at least, a professor or something recognizable. And I had done my honors work my last year in college with a brilliant professor. We had great professors because all of these magnificent poets and writers and thinkers who didn't want to go to the Vietnam War were teaching. So this professor was teaching us Shakespeare while comparing it to paintings of, I think can fall out of my mind, that very bizarre, fantastic Dutch painter.
Bosch.
Yes. And this was a course that I don't know, I could have stayed in that course 24 hours a day. It satisfied something in me. And so I began to look at everything that I was reading in literature through this lens. And I did my graduate paper on Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And I was invited in my, the first year of graduate school to be in this amazing symposium. And there were only 2 women and 12 men and a very revered professor. And lo and behold, we were studying Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So I would raise my hand, go on page 34. There's a little reference to the flower on the 3rd line from the bottom. And I think that he just kept cutting me down and cutting me down. And I was so startled and also humiliated. And after the class, the other woman, who was really interesting to me because she seemed so much freer than me, came to me and she said, "You should drop out of graduate school." She said, "I did." And then I said, "What did you do?" And she said, well, I went overland to Afghanistan. I joined a circus in Paris. I found out who I am, and then I came back. So being impressionable and also so stunned by what just happened to me, which was sort of a, I don't know, professorial version of my household I grew up in, this Jewish family, I dropped out of graduate school and gave back my fellowship. But I went back to New York and I kept it a secret because I had finally some relationship to my parents again. And but accidentally, about 15 minutes after speaking to my father, so-called from Toronto, I bumped into him on the subway in 86th Street. So I was outed. But that summer, I tried out for a play at La Mama, and I got the part. It was a really strange experimental play right up my alley. I was a sort of Japanese geisha who roller skated, went into trance, stripped off her kimono, and turned into a Native American woman who could go into trance and speak Swedish, and was married to Hervé Vilches, the midget. So this was right at my alley. My father, of course, was shocked when he came to see it and wanted to know when I was going to speak English on stage, which didn't happen for a while. But nonetheless, I lost my job. I was a roller skating waitress in a jazz club, and I had to give that up because I had 8 plays a week, 8 shows a week. So I told my director, and she said, well, you know, you should teach theater to children. What did I know about theater? I couldn't memorize anything. I was just this bizarre person who could tap dance and make believe Swedish. So she organized all these kids. They were children of actors and actresses. And in my living room, we had our theater class. What could I do? I read them fairy tales and we acted them out in my living room. And then we went to Central Park in front of the Hans Christian Andersen statue, where they did their show to their parents and all this kind of like assorted, wacky Manhattan audience that somehow appeared on this sunny April day. And they wanted to do it again because their parents, of course, adored them. And they said, we need something in between. And they said, you do a scene. Well, I can't memorize. I've never memorized anything. So what I did, I just told a Russian fairy tale that I knew from my childhood. And during that, everything that I was seeking in experimental theater and all of that, just sort of unconsciously, I knew there was something happening between myself and the audience that was extraordinary. I didn't know exactly at the time what it was, and I sort of almost know what it is now after thinking about this and going on meditation retreats and studying and falling over. And so I thought to myself that I would find out and I would tell stories. So I got a job, and how I got this job, I have no idea, but I was the storyteller in residence at the American Museum of Natural History for the People's Center. And so I had to just keep coming up with stories. And I had access to this rare library, the library behind the library, where I'd read missionary journals, like seated on the floor, and just incredible about, you know, their encounters with indigenous first peoples throughout the world and the stories that people told and rituals, as you were talking about ritual and ceremony. And I realized that something was really in this that I didn't know. And then I met Joseph Campbell. So this whole series of accidents is what, you know, and then you make a decision. I thought, what am I going to do? So I thought, oh, I'll be a storyteller.
Wow, that's an amazing journey. And in those early days when you were on the spot and needed to tell a story, did you tell stories from your own life?
Not at that time, but sometimes to frame a story. Oh, I also began doing this wonderful and zany event, which I did for 3 years. Every Monday night, I had a radio show for adults called An Ocean of Story. And I had a great producer, Jenny Bourne, and we would interview storytellers because I married a musician. It was part of the World Music Institute, so I went to concerts, and a lot of these musicians were actually storytellers. So I would interview them and have them tell a story on the radio, but I began telling personal stories. Sometimes it was such a huge preparation, and I was obviously totally caught up in some kind of wild 1960s, 70s life. So I would get there sort of somewhat unprepared sometimes. And so I would tell the adventures of my cat and dog. And I had this whole relationship to them, and they were so funny. And then I started to get letters from people who would say, I love the story, about Pizzicato and Thelonious. Thelonious was the dog named after Thelonious Monk, and Pizzicato for a flute player I was attracted to. And so people started, so then I started thinking about how much people loved the myths and fairy tales and folklore is telling, but then this enormous interest in my life. So I decided that I would combine them. So I would tell a piece of, a great story, and then in the middle of it, I would say, oh, and while she's in the desert for 20 years, let me tell you what happened last night to me. And I started that, and then it just kept going, because I felt that if people could feel how personal these traditional stories are, and how mythic our ordinary lives are, which I was learning from Joseph Campbell. I was so lucky to take those workshops in those years. Then maybe I could be useful in the world. Also, it was great fun, just sort of harvesting all of these kind of odd things that, if you pay attention to, are near magical sometimes, or just the way that life is so, even boring things can be really interesting when you put them in the context of something else. The world is multi-layered, and so it's just been something I've been doing for like 45 years. And I love seeing how storytellers are now doing that more and more, just shifting time, and seeing really knowing the importance of these great myths to our lives, not as, these sort of like, extraordinary stories that exist from other cultures like artifacts, but that they are also, that they are the vehicle through which we reconnect with what we have lost in this world, which is a sacred view and a connection. And also, like I say, being able to work with the shadow. I went to Haiti after the earthquake, and other places like that. I went to Romania to work with Roma women, another accident, but recognizing that we can't always look directly at our shadow because we will explain it immediately or try to understand it, but the story could take us through it, where you could actually feel it without being triggered and then come out the other side. And that practice, that inner transformation or experience that you could dream and feel and imagine, which you couldn't because of the incredible and propulsion of traumatic events that keep us stuck, and how we're taught to be stuck. We're not taught to know this dual nature of our mind, of joy and sorrow simultaneously, or be intimately in something and witness it at the same time without getting stuck. Easier to do while telling a story than it is in my own life, but working at it.
So from the beginning, story for you was not just entertainment, but something which had a healing function for an entire community. Is that fair to say?
Well, I don't know if I thought of it that way, but I think, anytime you tell a story, there is a certain interruption or distraction that's extremely healthy, like a pause. And you have to be somewhat entertaining. I mean, you have to be present also. Otherwise, people are listening with a like a pea part of their mind, a little part of their mind, and they're not really in it. Um, so of course, I think it's not like someone once wanted me to write a book on which stories would heal which neurosis or which story would heal which illness, and that just at the time seemed absurd to me.
Mm.
One, because I didn't really I like to find the roots of things, the root causes, and I was hardly there. But it just seemed like it wasn't a product, like a pill. It was something far more holistic. And what it could heal you from was from the fear of death to the acceptance of death, just because you're working with imagination and timelessness in the middle of ordinary image and time.
For me as a child, imagination was escape, right? Let's get out of here. This is geometry class. I'm bored, and so I would leave. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think some stories are simply escape? And is that frivolous, or is that actually healing? Or is escape just not even a useful concept when we're talking about stories?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Sometimes escape is really healthy because you get to sort of reboot.
Yeah.
But if you stay in the escape, like the escape room thing, like if you confuse your illusion with what's actually there before you've learned to actually discern what's actually there, which has its own dreamlike quality, but we're not going to go to that place.
Mm-hmm.
So, we do construct the world out of the stories we learn and believe. So, in this process of what you're calling escape, but I think it's almost a release from the tyranny of this view, like a waking dream. During the process, we're talking about the process, because even make believe you can be like a nomad. You go out to the other place and then you come back to where your grazing land is or your home is, different seasons. So I don't know. That's part. It's not that there comes a moment that I could explain this, but I think that being engaged in story, and I really love, I don't know whether I even teach storytelling, but I love creating situations in which people discover more about the story and simultaneously about themselves, because then it's a sense you begin to develop a sensitivity, because awareness is accessed not only your ability to understand or conceptualize, but there's some kind of intuitive knowing, which is a felt sense that for most of history people really depended on and trusted. That you made a line in the cave drawings, it wasn't aesthetic, but it was actually some relationship to the animal you might want to hunt. That energetic relationship, that was, or the Dogon who could see stars or sense stars that we just begin to realize because of very sensitive telescopes. There is more to us, this, but it's not intuition of fantasy or just like, oh, I'm going to do whatever I want. It is it is the challenge. There's a story I love telling. My brother actually gave it to me from a friend of his who collected it in the markets in Morocco, called The Robe of Love. And I named my book, one of my books, after that story. Long, difficult journey, blah, 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 blah. You know, and finally, the young woman who has lost everything returns to the palace in which she was living, and to the lover, which these are not like romances exactly, but these are inner states. And she said that was a really difficult journey. And he said, you knew who I was the first time that we met. And she said, then why did I have to suffer so much? And he said, if you want to know the nature of life and love, you have to make the journey. And that always comes back to me. Shiva is often telling stories to Parvati, his consort, on Mount Kailas. So comes many of the stories of the ocean of story. And at the end of the story, she'll, press her, her lips to his lotus ear and say something like, "Is that true?" And in the ocean of story, he'll say, "Only the one who heard the story can know." So it's not answering, to satisfy some part of us that would feel so much more comfortable if we could figure it all out and then get on with it, which is maybe part of our escape. But it's not, there's nothing wrong with that at the same time. But maybe that's one stage on the path, depending on how far you want to go. Since we're in such an emergency in the world, to restore or regenerate some kind of discernment and accessing this capacity to know the truth of what's actually happening from what we're inventing. Maybe some storytellers may want to make that journey. Doesn't mean that those who don't aren't useful. I think entertainment, I think you said it actually in one of your interviews, how great it is to be entertained. What a relief it is. You're lifted right out of your situation. You laugh in the midst of being completely attached to something that you can't solve, or you just sort of take a pause so that some fresh air comes in. Or just that's very profound in traditions, like the clowns who come onto the plaza during the Hopi ceremonies, who just right before you're going to go into the most sacred place, these clowns come out and they hit you with these kind of cloth penises and reveal all what you thought was a secret about your life that they've been insidiously collecting. And everybody's laughing because nobody escapes from our shadows, or we think nobody knows that we're just as crazy as the person next to us. So they're laughing, that release, then you go into the situation and you are opened so that something penetrates you and you can access that part of yourself. So I like to interrupt my stories and just talk to people.
Yeah. It seems to me that in this country, stories that involve magical events are usually thought of as stories for children, and that adults, it's generally assumed, want real stories about real life things. This is what is kind of assumed, despite the fact that adults crave that kind of magic and wonder and seek it out in other places, like through games on the computer or through films and TV shows. Do you have any thoughts about this?
First of all, we've been taught for more than 15,000 years that these myths and fairy tales, these stories are make-believe, that they are of lesser cultures, that they're people who didn't have science or understanding, so they're called primitive rather than first or original or whatever, different. So there is a kind of natural thing of that, like, I remember when I first started telling stories in this children's center uptown in Manhattan, and people would come up and say, "Why don't you just tell something like about a truck?" Because I really hadn't ever thought to do that, basically, and they would have listened, completely involved in the story while they listened. I was hired in Bryant Park, which is behind the 42nd Street Library. And up until recently, now it's really sort of jazzed up and gentrified, but it was really a sort of like horrible place. There was intermittently between the grass, just beer cans. And I was hired to tell stories. And I went up the day before, and there was a cordoned off area and some Shakespearean actors. And they had microphones and lights. And I thought, oh, that's really nice. And so I went, but I couldn't find anything like that. And this guy was standing by a fountain with a little sign that he was from the Arts Council. And so I said, hi, where am I telling stories? And he said, oh, anywhere there are people. And he said, yes, 2 days ago there was a clown. We had a juggler the other day. And I thought, oh my God, really? And I had this really hot summer, and I had this backless flowered dress, and looked up, and there were a couple of people hanging out against the fountain. So I thought, I'll tell something funny and get out of here. This is terrible. And then this man looked at me. He was bare chested, and he this huge vat of ice cream, looked like a fluorescent light he was eating. And I just had this pang when my eyes met his, and a story came to me, an Egyptian folktale that I had learned for children, actually, but is profound for everybody. And I just started telling it. And he had his, sort of spoon in the air and his eyes on me the whole time. And I never took my eyes off of him, although there were other people around me, people throwing beer cans at my feet. The guy from the Arts Council disappeared into thin air or went to a cafe, I don't know. And when I finished the story, suddenly this man put his spoon back and he started walking toward me, and I panicked. I thought, oh, this is the time when you get knifed in the park. He said to me, hey, you're coming back tomorrow. And I said, no, they just hired me for today. And he said, man, that was like real life. He really found himself in that story. It was a boy who was hated because he was ugly and stupid and considered useless. And he sold his soul so that he could become charismatic and wealthy and so forth. And, anyway, those things really changed me. I was fortunate.
Many indigenous cultures see the stories as living beings. Do you relate to them in that way?
Well, I'd be presumptuous to know how First Peoples could feel and consider it, but because the story is not a product or text, I do feel often and more it is a living being. I mean, because it is my connection to spirit. I would love to be opened more so that I would have that experience with full confidence. Maybe before I die I will, or at the moment of death. Oh, but for me, this story is not what I'm telling or what somebody's hearing. It is this mediated, dynamic space of intangible and vivid image and experience and space that happens between us, which I think of that more as the story, arising moment by moment. And because it's shared in that way, it is very alive. It's that quality of aliveness. I mean, I really thrive on that because it's the place where I feel alive in this special way that then I can have in my everyday life, like a knowing, like I know that underneath this building, this concrete crazy street and the subways, there are still live springs that are flowing.
Thank you, Laura. We didn't get to the embroidery, but
oh, we should talk about that sometime. It led me, just tell you quickly, to buy a book that was on sale for $150 on embroidery. And then I found that this author, here's the book. It's called Goddess Embroideries by Mary Kelly. And then I got all her other books. I was able to download them. And it is a symbolic language, and that the embroideries on clothing had efficacious protection, fertility. It was that these images lasted 2,000 years or more and more through migrations. It was the language that women could connect with this life force energy. So that really makes that story for me so rich. But it took about 10 years to find these books, and then I went crazy, which I often have these interludes of like reading chasms in which everything I know has to be remade over again. You're nodding. People can't see you nodding and smiling and sweating happily in your beautiful scarf.
I fall in love so with a story. It's like there's no other story. I tell the Odyssey, and it's like that's it. The rest of my
Oh
life.
God, that is it.
Yeah. And then I have something happens. I have a gig. I do a Norse myth, and suddenly, all right, it's Freya. It's Odin. I have to uproot the trees and move, and it's almost like a love affair. And it's like that's over, And this is the
And then because you worked on one story, the other one speaks to you. It's like, oh, so you talk to Baba Yaga over there. Now I'll talk to you. They reveal each other. They have connections like the roots of trees.
I've been speaking with the American storyteller Laura Sims, and you can find out more about her work at her website, which is laurasims.com. Sims, SIMMS.com. And I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. There are more interviews and stories on my website, which is jayleeming.com, JAYLEEMING.com. As always, thanks to the many Patreon supporters who make this possible. If you are able to join them, please consider doing so. It helps to get the vital work of story out into the world. Thanks very much for listening, and take care.